Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you're a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session dealing with vicarious trauma as a welcomer of newcomers. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Let's go to the next slide. As a reminder for everyone joining the call today, there's a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. Please use the questions box, not the chat. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel to submit a question in the questions box so that we can assist you. Additionally, the presentation, any resources, and a recording will be sent to everyone following today's webinar, which brings us to our presenters for today. Nora Gardner-Sinclair, an LCSW from Creative Family Counseling, and Leslie Cashin, an LMFT from Creative Family Counseling. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, so we can go to the next slide. I'm Nora. I am a therapist. I've been here in Louisville for about 3 years, and I specialize in trauma-focused treatment, which means that I have worked mostly with clients who are survivors of trauma throughout my almost 10 years of working in therapy. And
I'm Leslie, and I work here in Louisville with Nora at the same practice. And also do telehealth, and I work also with people who have experienced trauma and trauma survivors, and I don't quite have as much experience as Nora, but I'm getting there.
Yeah, plenty. And Leslie and I have given some different versions of this talk and some of this, passed along some of this education to fellow therapists, and we are really excited to be here with all of you today. We, are very grateful for the work that each of you is doing in your capacities to help refugee families and people who are coming into our community. We're glad you're doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my practicing sites when I was in school was with refugees, and so I have a close proximity to this population, and I definitely recognize my own experiencing of vicarious trauma while working with that population. So it's really great that we get to help with this presentation.
And a lot of the information that we're going to share with you guys has come from a book called Trauma Stewardship. The full title is Trauma Stewardship, an Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. It's written by a woman named Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky and Connie Burke. Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky has also started a foundation called the Joyful Heart Foundation, and she's been kind of really pioneering a lot of this work about the impact of sitting with survivors of trauma on us as helpers. So we will share that book with, with Derek so that you guys can have that information as well. But a lot of this material is taken from her work. So we can go to the next slide. Okay. And so we're going to tell you what we mean by vicarious trauma. It's often called secondary trauma as well. So you may have heard recently there are some other terms that get floated about in this conversation, and one of those is burnout, which is just simple physical and emotional exhaustion related to stress. You may have also heard the term compassion fatigue, which is it goes a little bit deeper even than burnout. So feeling compassion eroding away, showing less ability to tolerate other people's emotions and pain. What we are talking about today, vicarious or secondary trauma, is a fundamental shift in our worldview and inner experience that is a result of engaging empathically to other people who are in pain. So VT or secondary trauma is really a cumulative impact on someone who is opening themselves up to the experience of another person who is in pain. And it is unavoidable when we work with people with empathy. So if some of these things that we share with you sound familiar, or if you've noticed some of these impacts on yourself, know that this is happening because you have opened yourself up in a genuine and meaningful way to the experience of someone else. And vicarious trauma is often talked about as an individual problem. So a lot of times you might hear, and we'll certainly talk about things that you can do as an individual to mitigate the impact of all of this, but it really is also a systemic and an organizational problem. So the load of vicarious trauma is also impacted by some of our other identities. So if we have other pieces of our identity where we might be navigating the stress of systems of oppression in our culture, if we are dealing with impact of racism on us as individuals, or if we are dealing with the impact of gender-based violence, or if we are dealing with the impact of homophobia or other types of systemic violence, that's going to impact the load that we feel when we're interacting with other people. And a lot of times this can be framed as, well, if we just learn to manage this better, all of this will go away. But one thing that we really want to offer to you guys today is that the issue is not just an individual's lack of self-care and an individual's lack of wellness, but it's the nature of the work. And this quote at the bottom is from the book, Trauma Stewardship. She cites it, and it says, "The expectation that we can be immersed in the suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water and not get wet." We can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so a lot of the signs that you are experiencing vicarious or secondary trauma show up in our bodies before we even realize that we're experiencing them mentally. So some of the ones listed here under the physical side might be difficulty sleeping. It might be chronic exhaustion or fatigue. It might be pain in our joints or in our body somewhere that's unusual or not by an injury. It might be tension. I don't know how many of you carry your shoulders like this, but I tend to want to stretch a little bit and relax your jaw when we talk about tension. And increased susceptibility to illness. I know for me, when I'm in a lot of stress or experiencing secondary trauma, that's usually when I get sick. So it's another sign of that. Behaviorally, it might show up as overworking, overplaying. So you're either working so hard or you're avoiding work by playing all the time. Escaping, trying to daydream a lot or just leave mentally or physically. Addictions, that can be a sign of vicarious trauma. Conflict in relationships, oversharing details of the trauma, of someone else's trauma or even your own. Inability to listen, engineering control, withdrawal and isolation. Inability to be alone, struggling with boundaries, valuing rules over people, right and wrong, that kind of thing. Shifts in your sexual life and perfectionism. And none of these I'm listing are things that we're not trying to persecute someone for feeling those things or experiencing those things. These are ways that you are struggling to keep yourself safe by something that you are feeling on the inside. So it's not an outside stressor necessarily that you are experiencing. And so our brains and bodies are trying to figure out, how can we keep ourselves safe when this is something that's kind of just lingering in the air. Next slide, please. Some more psychological or spiritual ways that it might show up are nightmares, intrusive thoughts, indecisiveness, forgetfulness, avoidance, anxiety, fear, guilt, anger, numbing, and that's where we see some of those addiction pieces. Hypervigilance, looking out for danger all the time, lack of trusting of yourself or other people, just overall sense of dread and cynicism about everything that in the world, resentment, helplessness, hopelessness, and despair, a negative view of the whole world, a sense that one can never do enough, a sense of urgency and scarcity, grandiosity and a rescuer. I'm going to save them. I can do all these things. a myth of immunity from pain. I don't have to deal with this. I don't have to feel this pain. Minimizing your own pain or someone else's, or minimizing the story. Diminished creativity, inability to embrace complexity, reduced empathy and sense of respect, and a resistance to new ideas or denial. The myths of vicarious trauma or secondary trauma are that I'm not safe, I am not enough, I can't trust anyone, I'm immune from other people's trauma and pain, or even my own trauma and pain. This is too much for other people to handle, i.e. I can't talk about it with my therapist or the people that I could get support from. Trauma will happen to me now that I've experienced under other people's trauma and hearing this trauma. Now I'm certain that it's going to happen to me. I can't make a difference. I don't have control. It's my job to save people. My feelings and my needs don't matter because this person has experienced this huge trauma that they're telling me about. So this other thing that I'm experiencing, even if it's related to theirs, it doesn't matter because theirs is so much bigger. Or I should be able to handle this.
And I'll share a little bit about some of my own experience with this. So when I first started off as a social worker, I was living in New York and I was working in an organization that worked only with survivors of interpersonal violence. So I was with people who'd experienced really kind of a whole range of trauma, and all of it was it was the worst all the time. I mean, the work was amazing, but the stories that you're hearing from people day in and day out, there was no break. Every single client who came in was truly suffering and had something horrible happen to them. And so a lot of this stuff, you might notice, can kind of come in waves. So you might have a couple of those physical signs one day, and then as time progresses, you might notice some of those psychological or spiritual impacts. So for me, what it looked like is when it first started showing up, after I'd been in the work for a little bit, I started noticing I kind of wanted my clients to cancel. When I didn't have to do the work and sit with someone in their pain, it was almost a relief because it was too much. As time progressed, I started having night terrors. I started really becoming very hypervigilant, moving about the city and going through my day-to-day life. I felt like I was constantly looking out for danger. There were times that I would feel like I either had to work all the time to make sure that I was doing everything I could to keep my clients safe, or there was nothing I could do, so why even try? And I was very fortunate to have supervisors and mentors and people who had been doing the work for a long time, who had navigated this path before and were able to help me name what I was experiencing as vicarious trauma and as the impact of this work on me as a person. Because before I had this information, my conclusion was that I was just a terrible therapist and I was just a terrible social worker and I was not cut out for this. And so if some of these things are sounding familiar to you, what we really want to offer to you is that is normal, that is understandable. It does not speak to the quality of the work or the quality of your presence with an individual or family, but just to the reality of how hard this is. So, yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah. So we can go to the next slide. So we're going to share some different strategies for you to use during a lot of times in this slide, you'll notice we use the word work. And if you are a volunteer, it's not work in the strictest sense, but it is a type of work. So that's what we're doing here. But some of these strategies are things that you can do before or after the work, and some of it are just general approaches that you can take. And a lot of this is not meant to be things that take up necessarily extra time, but meant to be ways that you might be able to cultivate an inner shift or inner awareness to help mitigate the impact of vicarious trauma. So each of these next few slides is taken from Laura Vanderbilt Lipsky's book, Trauma Stewardship. And she offers she calls them the 5 directions. And she does this really beautiful parallel with the cardinal directions. But these are all of, kind of the broader categories that we can think about to mitigate the impact of vicarious trauma. So the first part is choosing our focus and creating a space for inquiry. So some questions that you can ask that will help you find your focus and find some direction is, how do you feel physically or emotionally or otherwise before, during, and after work? So just taking a moment to take stock and notice, what is it that's coming up for you? How do you deal with challenging situations that come up? So when there's a crisis or a curveball is thrown your way, what does that feel like to you? How do you tend to cope with that? And how can you create space for self-regulation when you are actually with a family or when you are actually doing your work? So are there moments where you might be able to kind of take a break and step out when you need to? Are there moments where you can just, if you're taking a phone call and you're at home and a family reaches out to you, can you maybe step into another room that's not your bedroom? Can you be intentional about the place where you are doing the work? And if there is a place where you are often doing the work at home, if there's a place where you're usually communicating with other people, or if there is a space that you have some control over, are there any changes that you can make to the environment to remind yourself of mindfulness and peacefulness? Is there, some art that you can hang, or a fidget toy, or a fidget toy, or is there, if you got a cat around, can you, get the cat in your lap before you make this phone call? So what slight changes can you make to just remind yourself of that option that you have to find some grounding and find some peacefulness? And this is one of my favorite ones, and I think one of the really helpful kind of concrete ones to do is, how can you intentionally leave the space where you're working and re-enter the rest of your life? So if you're taking a phone call, can you take a few minutes and take a deep breath, or just notice your feelings and help yourself go from, the place where you are then to back to being with your family, or back to doing whatever else you need to do for the rest of your evening. When you are leaving a family's home, or when you're leaving running an errand for someone, can you take that moment to sit in your car and really tune into yourself? But having some mental separation, even if you're taking a call from home and physical separation is hard, having some mental separation from leaving that space to going into who you are as a person in the rest of your life can be really valuable. So.
Yeah, my therapist, this has reminded me of something that she's been teaching me recently, which is, she calls it doorknob intervention. So when you grab a doorknob to leave your room or to leave your car or whatever, that you can take a moment to breathe and leave whatever you're leaving, whether it's walking out of my therapy office into, the common space, or seeing a new client, or getting in my car to drive home or whatever, so that I can kind of intentionally transition that to stay there and take with me whatever I need to take, so I'm not in my head and thinking about that. So I think that might also be something helpful to think about.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And some of the things like that, I mean, that's a really powerful, because there's a concrete, tangible thing. Some of these things may sound small, and I just invite y'all to think about those moments where you just sort of careen through your day, and then maybe you get to the end of it and you're just worn out, or maybe you get to the end of it and you just at your family member, or something happens. There's so many times that we are just reacting to our day. That's a really beautiful image to pause. So some of that is what we mean by choosing your focus, intentionally deciding where you're going to direct your mental and emotional energy, letting work be work, letting play be play, and just getting curious about what you're doing. So we can go to the next slide. Sorry, that's my dog. We can go to the next slide.
Okay, perfect. This is good. All right. Building compassion and community is another one of the 5 directions. And that includes building a microculture. What relationships do you already have that allow you to feel safe and authentic? Who are your drainers? We've all been around that person that when they're calling, or when you're bumping into them in the street, or you're running into them somewhere, and they might, I think there's a show that has emotional vampires that I really enjoy, and those are the drainers, right? Those are the people who are oh no, I know as soon as I walk away from Susie here that I'm just gonna feel worse from running into her. And then who are the people that are your fillers? Who are the people that being around them gives you energy and gives you life, and you have meaningful conversations or can have a good time and play? And who are the people that you need in your corner? Who are the people that provide support, and who are the people that provide distraction? Who are the people who connect you to other parts of yourself? And those are really things to look for and to notice as you're going through life and having these moments, so that you can know how to connect more deeply to the earth, or to your people in your community, or with your relationship with a higher power. Maybe you're spiritual, maybe your higher power is running every Sunday morning for 10 miles, whatever it might be. Is there some way that you can connect more deeply to both the earth and the higher power that you personally feel or have? Who taught you compassion? How can you hold that person in your thoughts when maybe you have a hard time focusing on being compassionate for yourself, or focusing on being compassionate in a hard moment? Is there just a person that you can think of that you're like, oh, this teacher was really compassionate toward me, and I know if I think about them in some sort of grateful way, it will help me to be really compassionate toward myself or this person in front of me that I'm struggling to be present for in this.
We can go to the next slide. So the next in the 5 directions is finding balance. So finding some sort of way to not have the work with others taking up more space than it needs to take up in your life. So one way to do this is to think about the dimensions of resilience, so the different needs that we all have as humans. So movement, this is not an all-inclusive list, obviously. Movement, creativity, connection, spirituality, pleasure, those things that really help us withstand hard moments for ourselves, those things that help us feel like we're thriving. Cultivating gratitude. So I have kind of I don't always love when people talk about gratitude, because I think sometimes it sounds a little like, well, just be grateful for this awful thing that happened, or focus on the positive, right? And gratitude, when it's not used in a toxic positivity way, can be extremely, extremely powerful in mitigating some of this impact of this emotional load for working with folks who are suffering. So thinking about the beautiful qualities that you might see in some of these families, or thinking about some of the ways that they have found resilience, or being grateful that maybe for something that this work is teaching you as you move through your life, and the things that are around you in your world that help you feel safe and help you flourish. Gratitude can be a very intentional, powerful, non-hokey practice when we think about it that way. Mm-hmm. And then cultivating presence. So this is a mindfulness idea, but really being intentional about noticing beauty and finding moments of beauty, finding little moments of joy. So maybe there was a really hard moment with a family, but the kid did something kind of silly and some people laughed, right? And sometimes when we're overwhelmed with the reality of someone else's suffering or someone else's struggle, it can be really hard to notice those little things and to be present to the fullness of someone's experience. So the fullness of, all of the wonderful things that are present in families' lives, even though they've been through this one horrible experience, right? There's a lot of ways that we can be present to the fullness of someone. Cultivating curiosity and play. So finding those little moments where you can find playfulness, or where you might want to learn something new, or find something interesting, both within or outside of the work. As adults, we sort of lose that ability to play and be silly and kind of let ourselves have fun. So are there any moments in your life where you might be able to weave that in? And then how can I move energy through? So Leslie's example of running 10 miles on a Sunday would certainly do the trick, but you also don't need to be, that dedicated.
I'm not doing that.
But finding some way to physically move some of this energy, this emotional energy through your body. And so maybe that looks like sitting and taking a few deep breaths. Maybe that looks like just reaching up and stretching, or kind of getting a little more comfortable in the seat that you're in, you know. And then maybe sometimes it looks like taking a kickboxing class, or
making a good dinner that you really like.
Oh, yeah.
Putting some energy into that, or spending some time with somebody that makes you laugh or play or whatever, those kinds of things. When you talk about moving the energy through, it reminds me of Emily Nagoski's book when she talks about ending the stress cycle. And that's kind of, you know, when you're in that's vicarious trauma and your body is experiencing the stress that's more chronic than acute generally, right? The acute is like a particular stressful point. Chronic is more long-term. Then she talks about the need to find something to end that stress response cycle, and through play or rest or, you know, running or cooking or any of those kinds of things, which I think parallels really nicely with that. Can you move the energy through?
Yeah, it's beautiful. So we can go to the next slide.
So that daily centering is one of the ways that she talks about, one of the 5 directions. Identifying what can be put away at the end of the day and can have a day of rest. In our society, rest is not something that's prioritized. And it's something that's usually looked down on. Oh, you did what? What, you weren't productive? What, you didn't go back to work and do the 500 things you were supposed to do, and like all of those kinds of things, which is just continuing that stress cycle and not finding a way to center yourself and to rest. And one of the things about daily centering, I think, is really important to that, finding that place in yourself, finding that community. It can help you with all of that daily centering. It reminds me of when the pandemic started and I first started doing telehealth from home, and I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment at the time. So everything was in one space. And I was experiencing this vicarious trauma where my work was literally right there, where I was eating dinner or, you know, watching TV or playing with my dogs or whatever. So I started a new ritual of, like, at the end of the day, I would I'd log off my computer and finish all my notes, and I'd take all my things and put them away and turn it back into a dining table instead of an in-home telehealth studio, so that I could then make that transition with my body and my mind as well. So finding ways like that where you can put things away either physically or emotionally, or finding a way to be in touch with yourself at the end of the day to do that. I think it's really what she's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes it can be hard to feel like we have time for this. And so part of why we leave this very open-ended is because sometimes daily centering just looks like, you know, that doorknob moment where you just take a deep breath and you feel your feet on the floor and then you leave. Even if you have, you know, 10 minutes to spend on meditation or centering prayer or something that's meaningful to you, then that's great. But it also doesn't have to be that big. It can be putting out the router on your dining room table.
Yeah.
It also makes me think about, there was someone who we worked with in one of our groups who talked about commuting, even though she was working from home, where she would get in her car at the end of the day and she would just drive for 5 or 10 minutes because that helped create some separation and some centering before moving in. Yeah. Okay.
Next slide.
So, yeah. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you all so much for talking with us, for kind of walking through your ideas for what is vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. What are some ways to mitigate the effects? And just your entire presentation. Thank you. I want to just kind of remind people that, you know, we can begin answering some questions that have been submitted through throughout today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane. And yeah, let's see if we have any. And yeah, please do that in the questions pane and not the chat. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, interesting. Okay, so it said the questions box isn't enabled for some participants. Hopefully that changed. Let's see. Hold on one sec. Okay. Oh, hold on. Let me go to the front. Let's go to the top. Someone said, I believe you only noted 4 out of the 5 directions. Not sure if I missed one or if we decided not to cover one. They suggest one is like choosing our focus and creating space for inquiry. 2, building compassion and community. 3, finding balance. 4, daily centering. Was there another one that was there?
So choosing focus and creating space for inquiry are actually 2 separate ones that, for the purposes of kind of time, we lumped into one. So yeah,
Good catch. Good job.
People are paying attention. People are paying attention. That's great. Yeah, and if anyone else has some additional questions, please put that in the questions tab. But I have a question, a follow-up question for you all. One of the things I thought was really helpful, I mean, all of it was very helpful, but one in particular was sort of changing your mindset from thinking in terms of if these things are happening to me, these feeling burnout, feeling stressed, those kind of things, that's not, we shouldn't be thinking of that as a sign that somehow we're not doing a good enough job, that we're somehow there's something wrong with us or something like that. But just that this is a very natural part of working with other human beings, especially other human beings who have experienced trauma and are experiencing suffering, and we're in the midst of it, trying to be helpful to that. I think that's a very important piece. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about that and how maybe as perhaps a group of volunteers working together, how they can reassure themselves, reassure each other, or kind of create that sort of micro culture, within their team of kind of be preparing for that, understanding that, and helping out. What are some things that groups can sort of do together to set the tone, would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think part of it is talking about it and naming it. So having a shared vocabulary, a lot of times in offices that I've worked in, folks have used just VT because it's quick and, it's relatively short. But having some shared language for this impact on the helper and to be able to kind of help each other see when this is showing up, and having a culture where folks can feel safe to share some of those harder, more uncomfortable emotions. And so sometimes what that looks like is, if there's someone who maybe kind of keeps showing up late for appointments, or if there's someone who might not be, getting things right every time, instead of jumping to, this person doesn't care, or they're not focused enough, or they're not doing a good enough job. Sometimes things like that can be a sign of vicarious trauma. So having a culture together where there's this kind of shared understanding and generosity, where you say, oh, I wonder if this person's struggling a little bit. Like, I wonder if things are kind of hard for them right now. And kind of using some of this language of vicarious trauma to name that and talk about it can be really powerful.
Yeah, it's some of the things you're saying are also reflective of that self-compassion or compassion piece, of being able to recognize in a non-judgmental way that this is just a human thing that's happening, and this is the best way that we can deal with it. We're dealing with it the best way we can, and if I can get support from this community group that I'm in, that we're all kind of in the similar situation or same situation, then we are supporting each other in a non-judgmental and curious and open way, instead of well, I can't believe Sam forgot to, like you're saying, forgot the appointment, or I can't, this or that, or the other, or I'm dealing with this so much better than Frances over there. She, she can't even do this, or any kind of ways that either make ourselves feel better, or it's a way of projecting our own fears and insecurities on someone else. If we can kind of show up with that open-heartedness and that vulnerability and that compassion as opposed to judgment, it's going to be really helpful to both you and to the people that you're working with.
Yeah. Everyone's just doing their best.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think that really is helpful for groups of volunteers who are working together to really have some compassion for themselves as individuals and for other members of the group and for staff members at that local affiliate office, as well as obviously the refugee clients that they're working with. We're all trying to do hard stuff all together. Someone asked about, you had mentioned a specific author that some of this work and presentation was taken directly from. Could you share that again, and I can make sure if the specific book, I can send a link to a follow-up email and stuff. Could you let them know that information? We can follow up via email as well.
Yeah. So the book is, I thought about it and then I forgot to grab it from the office behind me, but it's called Trauma Stewardship: An Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. And the authors are Connie Burke, B-U-R-K, and Laura Van Der Noot Lipsky. So it's V-A-N, one word, D-E-R-N-O-O-T, another word, Lipsky, L-I-P-S-K-Y. And Laura Van Der Noot Lipsky is the one who has kind of, she's kind of been leading in this work. So Laura Van Der Noot Lipsky,
Awesome, thank you for that. And like I said, I'll send a follow-up for everyone via email with a link or some more information in writing there. Another person had a really interesting question about what are your thoughts on being able to create community spaces to share and talk about vicarious trauma while maintaining privacy of clients that you serve? How to cultivate it without broaching privacy? Should it just be with coworkers? Are there other places that we should seek or groups? How do we balance that need for privacy and confidentiality, but also be able to talk about things in a group with other people who you're working with or with others?
Yeah. Well, can't recommend therapy enough. No. and there certainly are places that offer vicarious trauma or those kind of trauma therapy groups. We have done that in the past. But also, especially if you're looking to create a space with your coworkers about this, then you can lay some ground rules about how you will talk about the family or the client that you're working with. How you will, you may have to say things like where they're from because it might be part of their trauma, and that the people in the space will know that this is a confidential situation. We don't want to be standing around the water cooler and talking about it, just like open in space. And also checking with the people before, okay, are we ready to talk about this? Are we on a good place where we can do that? Is anyone in a particularly stressed out or activated place where we don't have the tools to take care of ourselves right now? Or is this going to make it worse? So I think being able to have those leading up conversations is going to be really important to be able to make it a fruitful and supportive and compassionate space instead of just, oh my God, you won't believe what happened today, right?
And there's something that can also happen, I think, with vicarious trauma that I've navigated a lot within communities of therapists, where sometimes you feel like you need to share the most horrible or like gruesome pieces of information, because there is something, when you've been carrying something or holding on to something really painful, there is something really validating in seeing someone else's face go like, oh
yeah,
my God, like seeing that reaction in someone else. And that's totally understandable. And sometimes a helpful reframe can be to think about, okay, how much of this does the other person really need to know, and keeping the focus on like, how do I communicate my feeling about this to someone else? So someone else may not need to know the details of everything that happened,
Right.
but how can I share with them like this feeling that I have? So.
Yeah, those are great ways of kind of safeguarding and finding a good balance with the need to be able to express these difficult feelings and focusing on ourselves, not necessarily like you said, the every detail of the traumatic situation that occurred. Also prepping everyone, making sure that everyone really understands the need for privacy and confidentiality. Is this an appropriate venue, place, people, or is everyone in the same mindset as we're doing that? All of those things, really great ideas for sharing that. And I would just add to within a community sponsored group or group of volunteers, they have likely signed confidentiality agreements, understand with the affiliate office that that's important. And if you have any questions about that in terms of the logistics of what you're saying and what you can't say and under what circumstances, definitely have that conversation with a staff member at a refugee resettlement agency to discuss what that, in a practical sense, what does that actually look like in terms of how can I talk about this in more general terms, as opposed to, breaking that confidentiality. So within a community group, a co-sponsored group of volunteers with staff, as staff members talking about it amongst themselves or things like that, or vice versa. Those are all important ways to do that and to safeguard and find that good balance. Someone else just asked, what does RWC stand for? It's the Refugee Welcome Collective. It is a project, a technical assistance project that's funded by the State Department that CWS has the grant for, but the Refugee Welcome Collective is open to all 9 refugee resettlement agencies as well as others for technical assistance. Okay, and we made it in just the right amount of time. Can we go ahead and go to the next slide, and we will sort of we will end here. Do you want to read this, Nora, Leslie, or talk about it for a second?
So this is from Laura Vanderbilt-Lipsky's book, and this is just as a practice of centering ourselves before we move on from this space together. I wanted to share this with you guys. So how about we take turns? I read one, you read one. May I be free of suffering and the roots of suffering.
May you be free of suffering and the roots of suffering.
May we be free of suffering and the roots of suffering.
May I find peace in the roots of peace.
May you find peace in the roots of peace.
May we find peace in the roots of peace.
May I find joy in the roots of joy.
May you find joy in the roots of joy.
May we find joy in the roots of joy.
May I find wellness in the roots of wellness.
May you find wellness in the roots of wellness.
May we find wellness in the roots of wellness.
May I be free.
May you be free.
May we be free.
Thank you so much. Can we go to the next slide? Skip that one. Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to thank our presenters again today. It was wonderful to have you all here and to get to talk to you in this context. I am so thankful to everyone who has participated in this, and I know others will watch it in video form after the fact. So again, I just want to thank all our presenters for today, and thank you to everyone for attending today's RWC Lunch and Learn. If you have any questions, please contact info@refugeewelcome.org. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to view the recording of today's webinar, as well as descriptions of more upcoming RWC Lunch and Learns. On behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.